It's not all that often that you would need to issue a spoiler warning when talking about a racing game, especially one that's 11 years old at this point, but I know that some of you haven't had the chance to play this game since, in 2016, it was removed from being able to purchase it in the online stores of various consoles. However, you can still find physical copies, which is, to be honest, what I always played it on anyway, and although prices can be a bit stupid sometimes, I would urge you to do yourself the favour of playing this game before getting into this video or any other retrospective about Driver San Fran, because it does have a story. The story by racing game standards is Oscar level compared to what you would usually have, and even though there's a healthy layer of cheese on this particular bun, it's still a fantastic story in retrospect from what easily could have been just another racing game or just another driving game. To me though, what makes Driver San Francisco such a fantastic game and such a replayable game, even in 2022, is actually not so much to do with the story, and more to do with three things in particular. Now, just like my retrospective for Test Drive Unlimited, which of course I would recommend you check out as well if you haven't already, this is a very personal perspective that I'm going to be bringing up. So of course, if you want a traditional review, this is not so much the video for you, this is more what I loved about the game and why San Francisco was such a formative experience for me. Now, I believe there are three things which make this game have such a special place in my heart, and of course we're going to get into all three in this video. First of all though, what do you need to know about San Francisco? Well, it came out in 2011, which was one hell of a year for driving games. We had Dirt 3, of course this game, Shift 2 Unleashed, Forza Motorsport 4, my personal favourite of all Forza games, Need for Speed The Run, Test Drive Unlimited 2, the long-awaited and, again, for many of you, and myself to some degree, beloved sequel, and even Mario Kart 7, for those who are taking racing a little bit less seriously and less realistic perhaps. Of course, Driver San Fran was available on the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, the PC, later on in 2012 the Mac, and even the Nintendo Wii. Now the Wii is an interesting angle for this game, because although it's not a version that I, to be honest, ever played, so I won't be getting super into that, it's the only one which doesn't have particularly good scores. And even some of the mechanics of gameplay are completely different on the Wii version, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Now, the game revolves around, of course, you as the main character, playing a character called John Tanner, a returning face, being the fifth game in the series of driver games, and he is a police detective. You are joined on and off through the game by your partner, Tobias Jones, and you are tracking down basically your nemesis, if you will, a returning face from Driver 3, which, spoiler alert, I've actually never played, called Charles Jericho, often referred to in the game as just Jericho, and in my opinion, looks more than a little bit like Jack Nicholson in terms of inspiration. Now, toward the start of the game, this is where the spoilers immediately begin. Because put simply, Jericho escapes. While in a prison van, he takes control of the vehicle and a chase ensues. A chase which ultimately ends up with you being put into a coma. Now at the time, this is a little more vague within the game world, and it has a dreamlike quality which is carried over into certain aspects of the game which you might not have thought of before. And that to me is one of the subtle beauties of what made this, in my opinion at least, genuinely one of the greatest driving games of all time. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is the case is because think of the immediate aesthetic which this game gives you. From the soundtrack to the soaked in orangey yellow 70's vibe which the entire game has, but at the same time with this curious inclusion of over 140 real vehicles, fully licensed cars from the modern day. Even cars which you would never expect to be in a game like this and would be more at home in a game like Forza, such as Roofs or the Pagani Zonda Cinque even. Now the performance and even the physics aren't necessarily that realistic, and pretty much any supercar in the game can only do around 210 miles an hour regardless of what it is. But the point remains, these are very lovingly recreated vehicles with interior shots, pretty good recreations of realism, and aside from the performance, they are treated clearly with a lot of love, a lot of care, and a lot of attention. It's not just a slapdash together Grand Theft Auto style rip-off of real life, but rather a much more close approximation of it. Where the weird part comes in though, and where some of the genius of this game begins to shine through, as long as you think about it, is how these brand new vehicles, especially back in 2011, really don't fit, or at least they shouldn't fit, with that overtly 70s aesthetic, which the game is quite deliberately going for. The hero car being a 70s Challenger, the colour palette, the aforementioned music with over 70 licensed songs. Songs which are fantastic. In fact, in my opinion, it also has one of the greatest soundtracks of any racing game ever made, which of course made my complete playthrough of the game, a 2.5 to 3 hour video here on YouTube, completely unmonetizable because of all of that music, which I didn't even think of at the time of uploading. The reason why I believe this is a genius combination though, is because it doesn't make sense. Is the game in the 70s or is it in the modern day? Why can't it make up its mind? Well, at the time you don't know why, but as you think about it and as you progress through the game and realise that Tanner is indeed still in a coma, well, now it makes sense. Because the idea of being in the 70s, but with these strangely modern vehicles and having literal superpowers, is because you are almost in a dream. That's the whole point. Dreams don't make sense. You can do things in dreams that you could never do in real life. You can fly. You can have lucid dreams where you can control your abilities. And even if you look at the menu layout when you are shifting from vehicle to vehicle, of course a mechanic which I'm going to get into more in a second, being easily the biggest selling point of this game as an experience, you are seeing the map through a literal lens of an eye. Tanner's eye. Now as you look over this map, one of the most beautiful and most engaging maps in any driving game with an open world, aside from maybe Hawaii in Test Drive Unlimited that I spoke about before, and even then it gives it a run for its money, this ability is introduced very early on in the game, wherein you can literally jump, almost Matrix style, from the vehicle that you are currently in into a completely new car. Except the genius of this mechanic is that for the first time in any game that I'm aware of at least, you didn't stop the car, get out, or even Dukes of Hazzard barrel roll out of the car and hijack someone else's vehicle, Grand Theft Auto style. It was actually more cerebral than that. It was more meta. You physically change into the person driving that car. Again, a clear nod when you look back that this is a dream state. Sometimes there are passengers in the car who begin to notice you're not the right person. You might look like their spouse, brother, sister, child, whatever, but the way you talk, the way you drive, you're clearly not them. And it's almost like an inception moment where the characters within the dream start to uncover the ruse. It's a great level of attention to detail that the game didn't really need, and it's this attention to detail which is one of the 3 cornerstones of why I think this is such a brilliant game. Now the first one I've already discussed, and that is the tone. The tone of the game is so rich, it almost has a flavour. Those aforementioned colours, the complementary music, the strange dreamlike state, and the ridiculous abilities that allow you to literally jump around the map, it gives it a tone which is literally unlike anything else. Most definitely unlike anything else in that year at the very least, if not unlike anything else, period. The second thing is that attention to detail. Now to go into that for a second, the reason why the attention to detail in this game to me is one of the most impressive building blocks of what makes it so good is because it goes beyond just the aforementioned themes. The attention to detail actually goes down to certain things which are totally irrelevant to the gameplay experience, and which these days I feel like probably wouldn't have been included, unfortunately, because maybe it's just the soon-to-be old man in me or whatever talking, but back in my day, when they actually used to put everything in the game from day one, nowadays you have games which constantly need updates and additions to make them what they should have been from day one. In this game, for example, there are things like fantastically detailed tyre smoke, things like how when reversing the car, Tanner will put one hand and palm the steering wheel like a real driver would. There are moments where you, for example, have a horn in the car, but he physically presses the horn with his hand. These are very small things, but that's my point. Much like Horatio Pagani when building the Pagani Zonda and the Huayra, it's all about the detail. What makes cars like the Pagani Zonda, or a Koenigsegg, or a Spiker such beautiful pieces of engineering is not about how fast they are. It never has been. It's about the fact that every nut, every bolt, every washer feels like it's had the same amount of love and care gone into it as the Mercedes AMG V12 that it's powered by. In this game, beeping the horn with your hand is irrelevant. Palming the steering wheel while reversing, having billowing tyre smoke flowing out from the rear wheels. None of this was necessary, and so many other racing games, even top-tier titles like Forza and Gran Turismo, pale in comparison to those kind of feelings that seeing that represented on screen gives you. It's just a feeling of authenticity, and again it mixes what I said about tone with attention to detail. When you put these things together, they act in this fantastic way of reinforcing each other, each one alone being fantastic, but adding to the whole when you consider them as a compounded thing. The third thing goes back to what I mentioned earlier on regarding the shifting, if you will, from vehicle to vehicle, and that is what I would describe very simply as freedom. There is one other game which immediately comes to mind for me when it comes to the feeling of freedom which this game gives you. And interestingly, it's not a driving game, but it does come from a similar kind of era. You might expect me to have gone with something like a Test Drive Unlimited, but to be honest, there's something about this game which feels even more free than Test Drive Unlimited does, and it has a lot to do with the jumping from vehicle to vehicle. The game which it reminds me of, though, is actually Sam Raimi's era of Spider-Man 2. The feeling that you have swinging and jumping and climbing around a massive representation of New York, even back on the PlayStation 2, was just so captivating to a young mind, mine at the time. For many of you, probably yours too. You really did feel like you could go anywhere. This game feels like that, and it's honestly the only racing game that I've played to have that kind of feeling. Another game which I believe is a prime example, another one of my favourites, being the Prototype games. Of course, an altogether far more violent take on the Spider-Man aesthetic of jumping and flying and floating around the city, but with massive blades for hands. Again, one of my personal favourites though, this game manages to have that kind of feel, which is nigh on unseen in a racing game typically. Now, another one of the things which I love about the freedom aesthetic of the game is about far more than just jumping into different cars, because for one thing, it means that technically you never need to buy a car. Because you can buy cars, and buying them allows you to select the car from the garage and go straight out into the world with it, but within reason, you can jump into pretty much any car you see, unless it's owned by a character that you can't jump into, such as Jericho. However, that feeling of freedom also comes from the type of driving. See, this is not a racing game. It has racing in it, and the racing is very fun, but if you were just to score this as a racing game, it would get very low scores, because it's not important to the gameplay and it doesn't really take it that seriously. But if you score it as a driving game, well, very few racing games honestly can come close, even by today's standards. So what am I talking about here? Well, think of it this way. Let's say you drive around the map and jump into a street race, for example, which there are a number of. You can choose how you want to win. How many racing games can you say that about? You might have the illusion of freedom, where in Forza, for example, take Horizon 5, there might be multiple routes that you can take, or in a rally game, for example, with like a cross-country or rallycross event, you can take the Joker lap, where you take a different route and have a time penalty, etc. It's the illusion of choice, but you're still on the same circuit. Even an open world game like TDU, it's still a circuit that you go around, or a sprint race that you have to stick to the route of. Here though, in Driver, sure, technically there's a route, and you could just drive like an actual Need for Speed, Midnight Club, TDU style driver and win the race. Or you could jump out into Tanner's God's Eye view, jump into a massive rig, and destroy all of your opponents by throwing endless traffic in their way. as if you are God within this world. There's no other game I've ever played that gives you that kind of incredible feeling of absolute creativity. At the same time though, it doesn't negate skill. Having a God mode, it would usually be a cheat. Even just being able to see the entire map in real time could be seen as a cheat, but here it's a game mechanic. So because it's not an exploit or a mod, the game is designed to work against you within that world. And so instead of feeling like you're cheating the system, it feels like you're doing what the game is designed and intended to be doing. So sure, you can throw traffic or smash big rigs into your opponents, and under any circumstance in the game, you can use this kind of chaos to your advantage. You're supposed to, but at the same time, the game doesn't pause. This is not like the VAT system in a Fallout game. This is more like a system where it slows down time, which a number of games have played with the concept of, wherein your opponents or your target or whatever the case may be can still move. They're still driving around doing their own thing, except it allows you that moment to make a quick plan of attack and throw a vehicle in their way or create some kind of roadblock to give yourself the advantage that you need. It doesn't make it too easy for you, but it gives you a leg up, and it gives you the ability, as I said, to play the game to its own strengths and to enhance your own. The game demands creativity. It gives you incredible superpowers, but you still somehow feel limited by it. Not in a bad way though. The freedom is there, but the freedom has to adhere to a set of more logic-based rules, which I think is fairly obvious from what I've said. So for example, the freedom doesn't go so far as just blowing up cars from God's eye view, but the freedom allows you to decide how you want to take down an opponent, how you want to take an alternate route, etc, etc. To me, the combination of these three primary things make it an incredibly strong game in terms of replayability. Sometimes the game gets criticism on its story, but that's basically the only criticism I tend to see, and even then, let's be honest, the story isn't really bad. It's kind of like a cheesy 70's cop show. Let that sink in for a second. That's kind of the point. And that's why it's so good. It is cheesy. It's supposed to be. The fact that it has that dreamlike state jumping between 70's and today, but feeling like you're doing both at the same time, it just is such a complimentary whirlwind of game development. Now, to go briefly to that Wii version, which, as I said, I've personally never played, it has still pretty good scores, above average overall, like a 6 out of 10, compared to more like the 8s and 9s, which the traditional versions get. But the biggest difference, at least from what I've read about the Wii version, is that there is no shiftability at all. You cannot jump from car to car, and instead, very curiously, they decide to make the Wii version a lot more violent, because instead of shifting from car to car, you just have guns instead. That sounds interesting, and it would have been kind of cool to have guns and shifting, but then you might have felt a little bit too overpowered, to be honest, and it would have definitely garnered the game a higher age rating. Whereas, smashing cars around, you could get away with that more than, shooting Jericho in the head with an AK, which would have probably ended the game a lot quicker, but it wouldn't have been as fun. Ultimately, I think this game is a justified legend. This is not an example of nostalgia alone playing a big deal in why it is so cool to look back on Driver San Francisco and still enjoy it. Yes, nostalgia is great and it is fun, and as I've said on the channel before, you can weaponize nostalgia, and in fact many movies are doing so. Just look recently to, of course, the latest Spider-Man flick. The best thing about it was nostalgia. In this game though, it has a justified feeling of nostalgia, because the game itself feels nostalgic. Nostalgic not only to older driver games, but also to the era of driving. The 70's is known for driving movies, it's known for iconic driving cars and iconic music. So the game is intentionally playing and riffing on that nostalgia as part of its core experience. That, to me, is how to do nostalgia correctly. You create nostalgia not for a specific thing, but for an idea, for a feeling. It gives you the feeling that you had when experiencing an amazing moment or reliving a certain badass era, rather than just the cheap thrill of seeing a character return from an older game, which this also does, but it doesn't feel like the game relies on that. As I said, for example, I never played Driver 3. Jericho is a returning character, but it certainly didn't feel like I needed to have played that game, because this game just picks up right where you need to enjoy it as a first timer. Now the game of course was, as I said, removed from stores in 2016, and to this day it still remains a highly petitioned game for a return. What I will say is I don't fully understand why people are so concerned with it not being on the store, because you can still play the physical version. That's what I still have. So if you get the chance, of course, just buy the disc and you can still play it. Aside from that though, I really do wish that Ubisoft would re-enter this world and make another Driver-esque experience. Not necessarily a San Francisco 2, maybe a Driver New York or something like that, or somewhere else entirely. I think it definitely could work. The one thing which would concern me though is, honestly, I don't think it would manage to capture that same magic. I spoke in my video essay about TDU about a spark which the game had. For me, it's a spark which fewer and fewer racing games, and you could even argue fewer games in general, seem to have anymore. But for whatever reason, this was the golden era, it seems. From the 2000s up until the earlier 2010s, there were games which just felt unique and special. They didn't try to copy each other, they each had their unique take on racing. Even if you just think of the games which I rattled off earlier on, from a Forza 4 to a Driver San Fran, to a TDU 2 to a Dirt 3, even to a Mario Kart 7. None of them were copying each other, but so many of those are iconic and brilliant, proving that the concept of just holding a steering wheel and turning around some corners can be used to create so many different kinds of experience. Driver San Francisco is one of the most unique driving games I've ever played, one of my absolute favourites, and even though I wouldn't necessarily say that it inspired my growth as much as others like Gran Turismo, Forza, TDU, it definitely has a strong place in my heart. I loved it at the time. I can definitely get back into it and enjoy it at any time because of how infinitely replayable that world is. And again, for any who haven't played it, you've had it thoroughly spoiled for you at this point, but please do so. It's a fantastic game, feels very much like a throwback to when games had almost a more innocent love poured into them rather than an excess of marketing ideas and just sales numbers. It was still there, but it wasn't as obvious then. Ultimately though, that's it for my retrospective on Driver San Francisco. Of course, I hope that you guys enjoyed strolling down memory lane to take another look at this iconic game, and of course, if you are a fan of this game and loved it at the time as well, maybe even still play it to this day, tell me your thoughts down below. Do you agree or disagree with any of the points that I mentioned? Do you think there are additional things which made this such a fantastic game? Or a bad game, maybe, if that's your opinion. Ultimately, stick around on the channel. I do plan to do more retrospectives for a couple of other key games in my upbringing, and of course, as I said, if you haven't checked out my retrospective for Test Drive Unlimited, you might enjoy that one as well. But ultimately, until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.